Last week, I opened with this verse in John 13, where it says, in John 13, it's happening at the exact same time as these events. It says that Jesus loved his own to the end. And we talked about how that Jesus will love you and he'll love me to our end. In other words, he's never going to give up on you. Never. There's never going to come a moment when the Lord says, you know what? I've tried. And I can't do it. Everybody else, but not for you. God is always going to be for you. He's going to be with you to the very end. But there was incredible heartache that Jesus experienced in the process. And we looked at that last week. We looked at the arrogance of the disciples when they said, you know, I'll never deny you. But yet when the moment came, all of them abandoned him. We looked at the indifference that occurred. We looked at the pain that Jesus must have experienced. And this is all prior to the cross. And I'm reminded when I consider this, not only that Jesus loves to the end, but he told us that he did not come to be served, but to serve and to lay down his life. And it's one of the most difficult concepts for you and I to really wrap our heads around, that Jesus really meant it. A lot of people say it. But Jesus really meant it. He did not come except to serve others. His entire mission, his entire purpose was that you and I would be served by his life, by his words, and ultimately by his death. So we want to focus today, here in our chapter, we want to focus on kind of two events that occur. And these two events, and we'll talk about them extensively, but these two events are going to occur side by side. But the writer, the writer who is Mark, John Mark, he brings these two events together. They happened almost simultaneously, but Mark is the only writer in the Gospels, in the four accounts, who gives us this idea. He parallels these two events. And by paralleling these two events, he teaches us something that I think is really valuable in our lives. And I hope it's going to be as meaningful as, for me, it's been kind of meaningful. Before we get to that, though, first I want to tell you a story, and then I want to make a point to that. I remember hearing this story about a lady who was in Europe. She was about to board a plane from an airport in Europe, and she was flying back to the United States. And she had some time, so she went to one of the little shops, the overpriced shops that you can buy, bag of chips for $43 and 4 euros, $43 kind of a deal. And so she bought a bag of chips and she bought a water and she went and she sat down and she opened a book and she, was kind of just getting into the rhythm. If you've ever flown like that, you kind of got to be robotic. You just sit there and deal with it. And a young man came and sat near her, and to her shock, he opened her bag of chips and started eating them. Set them on the, he's here and she's here, and they were sitting right there, and he grabbed a chip, and he ate a chip, and she looked over and kind of shocked, like, who does this? Must be a European, right? So she grabs a chip, and she puts one in her mouth. And he kind of looked back, and he was kind of surprised, but he smiled, and he's like, okay. And then he grabbed a chip, and she grabbed a chip, and he grabbed a chip, and she grabbed a chip, and there was only a chip left, and she pulled the bag out, grabbed and ate the last chip. And the guy looked at her and he said, whatever, and he walked away. And she thought, I cannot believe how rude these people are. And they called her flight, and she gets up and she grabs her bag and she opens her bag, and there was her bag of chips in her bag. She's been eating this young man's bag of chips the entire time. And I tell you this story because you and I know what it's like. It's easier for us to identify as a victim. It's so easy to identify as a victim. How dare he do that? Don't they know who I am? How could they treat me like this? And then it's kind of shocking when we discover for ourselves that quite often we were the bad guy. It's easier to identify as the victim. It's harder to identify as the bad guy. And the reason I want you to understand this or to consider that is when we read our Bibles, it's easy to read our Bible as the victim. And in some ways it looks like this. So we're looking at Jesus, who suffered tremendously, who experienced incredible heartache, who was isolated, who was discouraged, who was put to shame. And it would be so easy, and this is a part of what is so common in our own mentality. It's easier for us to identify as a person who's experienced that. Jesus suffered, and I've suffered. And so what can I learn from Jesus in my suffering? That's a great lesson. Jesus was alone, and I am alone. So what can I learn about loneliness from Jesus? Oh, again, that's a great lesson. But it betrays one crucial problem in that equation, and it's this. We are not always the victim. Sometimes we're on the other side of the story. Sometimes we are not the person who is, yes, I feel lonely, but maybe there's reason or there's cause. Maybe I feel shame and there's reason and there's cause. And so when you and I look at the Bible, especially at the life of Jesus, we don't only want to see how he suffered and learn those lessons, but we want to put ourselves on the other side as well. What was it that caused him to experience that suffering? In the stories before us, it was the pain that his own disciples brought to his heart. And I would love to say to you and I will never be like that, but I would already be lying to you. Because the truth of the matter is that we're human beings. We make mistakes. And guess what? That's okay. God doesn't save perfect people, and that's the good news. So here we are at a story, and we're going to look at it. It's two events that are going to happen simultaneous. But we're going to look at one before that to lead up to this moment. And so we're going to pick up in verse 43, okay? Verse 43. Now remember, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's been praying. He's asked his disciples to pray, but they kept falling asleep. Verse 43, immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. And his betrayer had given them a signal, saying, "Whoever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away safely." As soon as he had come, immediately he went up to him, and he said to him, "Rabbi, Rabbi," and he kissed him. And they laid their hands on him and took him. And one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus answered, that's what I feel too, yeah. Jesus answered and said to them, "Have you come out against a robber with swords and clubs to take me? I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled." And then they all forsook him and fled. Verse 51, a certain young man, this is a great little add-on. A certain young man followed, having a linen cloth around his naked body. And the young men laid hold of him, and he left the linen cloth, and he fled from them naked. Mark's the only one that tells us that, and you want to know why? It was Mark. It was his story, Luke is like, "I'm not going to tell it." John's like, "Don't need to tell it." Matthew's like, "Don't want to tell it." Mark's like, "I'm telling it, baby. It happened. It was me. I was there. They grabbed me. I was not being taken. I didn't care what I was wearing. I was out of there." And he ran in his birthday suit because he was not going to be captured by the Romans. So let's go back to the top of this little section. First thing I want to talk about is this. There's three things that are going to happen here. Number one, Judas's kiss. Judas told the soldiers that when he gets to Jesus, he's going to kiss him, and that's how they'll know which one is Jesus. Because Jesus was not 7 feet tall, blonde hair, blue-eyed, walking on air. Jesus looked like every single other person out there. There was nothing that made Jesus stand out from anybody else. And so Judas said, when we get to the Garden of Gethsemane, I'm going to kiss the one that is Jesus. He is the one that you are to arrest. Now, we've been living in a culture where did you know that in most of Europe, and I don't know where it is, and maybe it's true in places here, but you greet each other with a kiss. You've seen that, you've seen it like in Italy when the mwah, mwah, the 3 times, it's a lot of love, And the first time I moved to Hungary, when I first moved there in 1993, nobody told me that, which was a very awkward experience. When this gal came up and she was so happy to greet me, and she comes up and she moves in for a kiss, and I'm like, where did I just move? What planet am I on? But then, and so there's a lot of countries where that's what they do. You greet each other with a kiss, and the Bible says, greet with a holy kiss. So Judas was doing something common to the time. But there's something I want you to notice, and it's this. It's not clear in the English translation. Judas said, I'm going to kiss him. Just a simple kiss. I'm going to go up and kiss him on the cheek. That would be a proper greeting. But instead, what he does is he comes up and he kisses Jesus on the cheek, but it's a different word. It's a word described when you're talking about a kiss that would be given because you're very close. You're deeply connected to this person. It doesn't have to be romantic, but it just means, man, I love you so much. Consider the betrayal that would have been like for Jesus in this moment. That Judas chose the kiss of someone who says, I love you. I love you. And that was how Jesus was betrayed. The second thing I want you to see here is Peter's defense. Peter made a defense. Mark is kind of nice about it. Remember, where did Mark get his information? One, we know he was there. He was there. He was an eyewitness to the events of these days. But he was also very close to the rest of the disciples. And so Peter has been declaring, and this is an important bit of information for the rest of our time together. Peter has been declaring that he will never deny Jesus emphatically. Even if all of these deny you, Lord, I will stand by you. Peter has been insistent that he is going to stand by Jesus no matter what. So much so that when Jesus said to all of his disciples, bring no sword, bring no weapon with you. This is not the time for fighting. Leave them at home. Instead of listening to that, Peter brings a sword with him. He brings the sword. 3 times Jesus asked him to pray with him, and 3 times Peter falls asleep. So he can't pray with Jesus, but he's ready to protect Jesus. And when the time came, when Jesus was arrested because of the kiss of Judas, Peter pulls out his sword. And Peter charges, and we read that he cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant. Okay? So Peter cuts off the ear, just the ear, of the high priest's servant. Have you ever thought about the mechanics of that? How do you cut off just an ear? You're like this, right? You're swinging the sword like this, right? What did Peter do for a living? Yeah, he's a fisherman, right? This dude did not know how to use a sword at all. He had no business using that sword. He went fishing and he lopped off an ear. And then what does Jesus do? Puts the ear back on. And I thought about this and I thought, man, Peter, what a dope. Why would you do that? And the minute I start thinking of Peter as a dope, the Lord always kind of says, think of your own dopiness in the situation, okay? Because I can tell you, in all the years that I've had the privilege of serving the Lord, I think I've cut off a lot of ears. Honestly. I think I've lopped off a whole bunch of ears. Said something I didn't need to. Whack. Got impatient with somebody when they needed my patience. Ears on the ground. And the reason I say that is because all of us are prone to cutting off ears. And here's the good news. Jesus is in the business of putting those things back together again. The real Jesus, the one who loves you so much, you're going to make mistakes. Ears are going to fall. Things are going to happen. And you look back and you say, oh man, I wish I wouldn't have done that. There's kind of 2 kinds of people in the world, right? There's the kinds of people when they're in a difficult situation that they look back afterwards and they say, I wish I wouldn't have said that. And the other group is the people who said, man, I wish I would have thought of that in the moment. And there's a lot of ears that get cut off in the process. Oh, I wanted to get at that person, and I misrepresented God's heart. I hurt that person in the process. And Peter, in essence, chose to do things in his own abilities. Hey, Jesus needs me, and I'm going to help him. And the process ended with an ear on the ground and Jesus putting the ear. You know why Peter was not arrested that day? Because there was no evidence of a crime. It's the only reason Peter didn't it's the only reason he wasn't on a cross next to Jesus. There's no evidence of a crime. And that's how good God is in our lives. And you know what? I got to be honest with you. I think I've lopped off ears and didn't even know I did it. Jesus is so good to come around and say, sorry, and put it back on and fix things for us. So Peter's defense, Peter thought that he was going to stand for Jesus, and in the process, all he did was make it worse. But there's a third thing that happens in this story, and it's that all the disciples flee. Everybody who said that they would be there for Jesus bailed on him. All these guys said, we will never leave you. We will stand by you. But in that moment, they all took off. And I believe that there's a reason for that, and it's a pretty tragic reality. It's a tragic reality because it must have hit them in the face really hard, and it sometimes hits us in the face, and it's this. Maybe for the first time in their lives with Jesus, they've been walking with him, listening to him, talking to him, seeing him do amazing things, but for the very first time after 3.5 years of being with him, they saw what appeared to them to be, he's just another person like me. I had this high hope or expectation that Jesus is more, but when a few soldiers are able to take him down, he's no different than I am. And the disappointment that they felt in that moment created fear. Fear created doubt. Doubt created confusion, and they all bailed on Jesus just like that. Why? Because in that moment, he wasn't Messiah. He wasn't God in the flesh. He was the guy they'd put all their hope in, and with just a few guards, he was taken down. And they couldn't see what was really happening. They failed to see the bigger picture. They only saw that moment. And I know I've experienced this before, when I felt let down by God because in that moment, it seemed to me he was unable or unwilling or incapable of doing something that I needed him to do. But there's a bigger story that's happening here, and they didn't see it at the moment. In Luke's gospel, we read about these two men that were on the road. It's called the road to Emmaus. It was just a town. They were walking there. They had been a part of the festivities in Jerusalem, Passover. They had seen and heard about Jesus. They loved him. They were interested in following him. And then they were totally disappointed when he was crucified and killed. And when Jesus rose from the dead, he went walking with them, and they didn't know it was him. It's like an undercover boss moment, He's just like, he just shows up, And he's like, so tell me, what's going on, And they're like, oh, well, we were in Jerusalem. And don't you know about these things? No, I don't know what you're talking about, And they said this, we hoped that he was the Messiah. You see, that's the issue that was crushed on this day in Gethsemane. What was crushed was the hope that this guy was really the Messiah, that he really was the answer to everyone's problem. Instead, they were disappointed, and because they were disappointed, they let fear take control of them, and they all fled for their lives. Everybody who had been with him for years, the people he loved and poured his life into, they all bailed on him just like that. Because they looked at him with his hands probably behind his back, being mocked, being taken away, and they thought, wait a minute, this is the one who multiplies food. He's the one that raises people from the dead. Why can't he get away from them right now? And they were disappointed. They didn't see who he really was. Mark tells us that he was one of those people. I so appreciate that Mark tells us that he was there and that he fled as well. It's important because he's identifying himself with the same problem that Jesus said, all of you will abandon me. And Mark is there to say, Jesus was right. I abandoned him as well. I left, in his moment of great need, I left him. Now, as I said to you, this next section, and this is where we want to spend some time, this next section focuses on two issues. One is the trial of Jesus, and secondly, it's the denial of Peter. And Mark, our writer, parallels these two events. And there's a reason for that, and we're going to look at it. Let's pick up in verse 53. Verse 53. They led Jesus away to the high priest. And with him were assembled all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. But Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. And before we go anywhere else, I just want to remind you of this. John Mark got this story from whom? From Peter. Peter, years later, tells Mark, you have to write this event. People need to know what I did and what the Lord did in the process. Don't take it out. Now listen, if you're trying to create a new religion, hopefully you're not, but if you were, listen, you don't start with the failures of the leaders. You prop them up, right? They're amazing. They're the best. They're the greatest. Everything they do turns to gold. And Peter, as God's beginning a new work, this thing called the church, Peter says, Mark, I heard you're writing a story about Jesus. Please tell everyone what I did. Not because I'm so ashamed and everybody needs to know what a terrible person I am, but I want them to know how amazing God is. And they need to see it. And they need to read about it for all of eternity. So Mark tells us that when Peter was there, Peter was a part of this story. So the scene is set here. Jesus is taken into this trial. And this trial occurred before what is called the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was a group of 70 leaders among the Jews. Pharisees, Sadducees, high priest, the chief priests, the scribes, the head honchos were all brought together. And they would hold court. Maybe most important thing for you and I to know about this Sanhedrin court in those days was this. They had no capacity to pass judgment on a criminal on their own. They needed Rome to make anything happen. Capital punishment especially was out of their boundaries. So even if they wanted to hurt Jesus, they really had no ability except by Rome's authority. So here they are, they bring Jesus into this court, and probably most important thing for you and I to know about this court as well is that it's a total joke. Nothing about this trial is either legal or ethical. It was done in the dark. It was done in a way that it never should have been done, but it happened. And the Bible tells us what happened. Verse 55, the chief priests and all the council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. Verse 56, for many bore false witness against him, but their testimonies did not agree. And some rose up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But not even then did their testimony agree. So Mark is trying to make sure that we know one thing about this trial, that it was a joke, that there was nothing legal about it, there was no clear court case at all. And so they brought Jesus there and they said, you're under arrest, and we are going to try you. And there's a whole bunch of people that say terrible things about you. Bring in the first witness. They bring in the first witness, and he says, yeah, I heard Jesus said this, and I was there, I heard him say this. Bring in the next witness. They bring in the next witness, and he tells the exact opposite of what the first witness said. And now all of them are like, oops. Bring in another witness. They bring another, 3 stories, 4 opinions. It's getting worse. It's getting worse. It's getting worse. Did you notice Jesus doesn't say a word? Why? You don't defend yourself when they're doing a terrible job of accusing you. What's the point in defending yourself? And finally, they found a couple people to say, Jesus said he was going to destroy the temple. That was like the biggest no-no in Israel. You don't speak against the temple. No. That is the holy place of Israel. And one of them came in and said, Jesus said that he's going to destroy this temple. There's a bit of truth in that, isn't there? If you've read the Bible, you know that Jesus did say that. He wasn't speaking only of this one temple, but of his own body. They brought another witness in. Did Jesus say, yes, and he said this, and he said this. Uh-oh, right back to contradictory testimony. Okay, let me summarize what Mark is saying. You ready? The case is going terrible. It's not working very well. The strongest case they could make, and there's nothing happening. Verse 60, the high priest stood up in the midst. So imagine this. The judge on the court stands up and now becomes the accuser on the court. Not much of a fair trial here. Verse 60, the high priest stood up in the midst and he asked Jesus, "Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?" But Jesus kept silent and he answered nothing. Again, the high priest asked him, saying to him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" The case wasn't going well. Accusations were being made, but they were contradictory. And so the high priest brings his own accusation. "Are you the Messiah?" That's in essence what he asks. Verse 62. Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his clothes and he said, "What further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. Verse 65. Some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, and to beat him. And they said to him, "Prophesy." And the officers struck him with the palms of their hands. I want you to see here first that when the high priest asked the question, everybody knew really what the question was. The high priest asked the question, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And maybe you will hear today, there's some who believe that, there's the idea that like Jesus never claimed to be God. He only claimed to be the Messiah, and that's a contradictory statement. Jesus here makes a very clear agreement. They asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" What does it mean, the Son of the Blessed? Really simple. You ready? It means, are you saying you're God? Are you saying that you are God? And Jesus answered I don't think he could have made it more clear than he did on that day. "I am." I don't think he whispered or talked out of the side of his mouth. "I am. I am. And you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds one day." And he tears his robe. Why? That was a sign of somebody has spoken blasphemy right now. Somebody is claiming to be God right now. How dare they do that? You see, every Jew in that day knew exactly who Jesus said he was. He made it very clear. "I am God who has come down to earth." And then something strange happens. They pass verdict against him. He's guilty. And here's what happened. Did you see how quickly their restraint disappeared? It was as if you had all of these wild animals being held back, and the minute that you removed the gate, they attacked. And any sense of judgment or of fairness or of justice or any of that was removed in an instant. The minute that high priest said he is guilty, everyone just leapt on Jesus and attacked. And they went after him. And they began to spit on him. How quickly the tides turned. And as he's being dragged away, the soldiers are slapping him. They're covering his face. They put a bag, kind of something over his head, and they're beating him, and they're saying, "Hey, come on, you're the king, you're God, prophesy, who just hit you? Come on, if you know everything, do something about it. If you have the power, do it." And it was as if in that one moment, they were unleashed against him. And you say, how does that happen? Because it was building up for years. And their flesh. And when the Bible speaks about a person's flesh, it speaks about the carnal, the natural, or just our natural tendency. What you and I do when God's not involved, that's the flesh. And their flesh, when God wasn't a part of it, they just went after him. in a moment. Isaiah 50, verse 6 says, I gave my back to the smiter and my cheeks to those who plucked out my hair. I did not hide my face from shame and from spitting. The Bible said this was going to happen. Peter was there. Peter was right outside looking at these things. In fact, I want to read to you 1 Peter 2, verse 23. Peter himself wrote these words, when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he trusted to him who judges justly. How did Peter know that? Because he is watching these things. He's right there. He's right in the outside court watching Jesus be tried. Verse 66, as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and she saw Peter warming himself, and she looked at him and she said, you were with Jesus of Nazareth. He denied it. He said, I neither know or understand what you are saying. And he went out on the porch, and a rooster crowed. Verse 69, the servant girl saw him again, and she began to say to those who stood by, he is one of them. But he denied it again. And a little later, those who stood by Peter said to him, surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean, and your speech shows it. He began to curse and swear, I don't know this man of whom you speak. A second time the rooster crowed, and Peter called to mind the word that Jesus had said, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And when he thought about it, he wept. Terrible ending to the chapter. You know, when the Bible was written, it didn't end with chapters. You know, Mark didn't say end of chapter. Story keeps going. We'll look at it next week. But Peter had made a promise to Jesus. Earlier in the night, Peter made a promise to Jesus, a promise that he should have never made, a promise there was no way he was going to keep. And the promise was this, I will never deny you. I will never leave you. And Peter should have never made that promise. And you know how I know that? Jesus had just gotten done telling him, all of you will deny me. You're all going to abandon me. And I don't think Jesus looked at them with that kind of judgmental look of like, you guys are losers, you know. How disappointing. All this investment and this is what you'll do on my weakest moment. I just think Jesus is acknowledging a fact. He wanted them to know, so when it happened, they could experience grace and mercy again. But Peter was not going to give up. Oh no. Sure, he slept in the garden when he should have been awake, but he was armed. He was ready. He had a sword that he used like a fishing rod. And even then, he should have been arrested, but Jesus covered for Peter, and so now he follows, and he gets himself inside the area where Jesus is being tried, and he's looking through the windows, and he's watching these events happening, and he's watching them smack Jesus and spit on him, and treat him poorly, and he's seeing this, and he's watching Jesus say nothing back. And a girl comes up to him and says, you're one of his disciples. I saw you with him. Peter says, no, leave me alone. I'm trying to watch Jesus. Walks away, deflects, moves on. Again, she says, I know you're one of his disciples. Now, there's something I think it's worth acknowledging. Peter might have been dumb, but he was surely brave. I mean, it's dumb bravery, but it was brave. These guys were in the garden with him when he cut that dude's ear off. And now he's in the courtyard right near all those same people. I mean, you got to give Peter some credit. It's misguided and it's wrong, but I'm going to still give him some credit. This guy was pretty brave. He was wrong, but he was brave. And so this woman says, hey, I know you're one of his disciples. And he says, no, I don't know what you're talking about. And then finally they say, hey, hold on a second. That accent, that's Galilean. Jesus is Galilean. A, B, we've put the dots together. You got to be him. And it says that he began to swear. And this doesn't mean he was throwing around 4-letter words. What it means is that he says, by God, by the temple. I'll bet you he said by the temple, because that was the big deal then. By the temple, I swear to you, I'm not one of his disciples. And after he said that, rooster crowed again, and Peter goes off weeping because he realized what he had done. We lived in a country where we were adopted into that country of Hungary for 20 years, and we learned the language, did it the best that we could, and it was always nice when I could get away with seeming like a local for about 3 minutes. After a few minutes, somebody would usually say, sometimes they'd be very blunt and they'd say, "What's wrong with the way you talk?" Or if they knew I was a foreigner, they would, have you ever noticed this, if somebody doesn't speak it perfectly, and so what do the people do? They slow down and they talk louder. Because talking louder is easier, right? No. I always want to say to them, I understand you and I can hear you, Right? But somebody with an accent, we think, oh, well, I need to speak a little slower and a little louder. I know what it's like to stand out for my accent. It was my entire adult life I stood out for my accent. And I could feel Peter on that day, big time. They're like, "Peter, or whatever your name is, dude, you're from the same area. You're over here lying and telling everybody you're not one of them. Your accent gives you away. We know who you are." And Peter tries to cover it with full-on denial, swearing by God, by the temple, doing everything he can. And the rooster crows, and Peter goes off and he's weeping. And here's where it all comes together. What does the trial of Jesus and Peter's denial, why are they intertwined here in Mark's account? Is it simply because they all happened at the same time? I think there's another reason. And I think the reason is really important. Here are a band of priests and religious leaders who hate Jesus. They hate him. They want him dead. They are acting out of their natural desires. God's not involved. It's what the Bible calls the flesh. Another way it's called in the Bible, the old man, the old nature, the natural man. They hated Jesus, and when they got the opportunity, they unleashed their hatred upon him. Then there's Peter. And Peter loves Jesus. Peter loves Jesus more than I think he loved anybody on the planet. But here's the problem with Peter's love. It's also the flesh. It's also man-made. It's also natural. And Peter was going to love Jesus even when Jesus says, "You're going to deny me." "I'm not going to deny you. I'll never deny you. I'm bringing a sword." "Don't bring a sword. I'm doing it anyways." "Don't be there. I'm telling you, you're going to deny me." "No, I will stand by you." "Aren't you one of his?" "No, I'm not, but I'm standing by you." "I'm sure you're one of those." "No, I'm not. Leave me alone." "But I'm standing by you." Do you understand the contradictions that are happening here? All because of love. And I guarantee, I'm imagining in this room, we're not on the hate side of the spectrum. But I wonder if we don't try to do things or say things or be something or be someone in a completely fleshly way that we call Christian. That's what Peter did on that day. It's exactly what happened to Peter. You can't describe this as spiritual at all. But it was all out of love. But when your love is only your love and it's not God's love, you run out. And we do it all wrong. Have you ever had those kind of days where you wake up and you're like, today, Lord, I'm going to love people. I'm going to be patient. I'm going to be gracious. I'm going to be kind. And you get to work and you're like, okay, Lord, it's not working. I made it to 9:03. And you're like, man, I thought I was more loving. And here's the reality. On your own, you are more loving. When there's nobody around, you are an amazing Christian. Dare I say, a super Christian. And then people get into your life. And here's what happens. We try to love them with our own strength, our own power, our own patience, our own abilities, and it eventually runs out. And love, listen, the difference between love and hate is when it's in your flesh, there's a fine line between love and hate. You see, everybody that day except for Jesus acted out of the flesh, acted out of the old man, acted out of their natural inclinations. And for the Pharisees, it led to hatred. But for Peter, it led to a fake love. A love that couldn't last. And I'm saying this to a bunch of people that I think either you know the Lord or you're interested in God. And if you're not and you're here, I'm so glad you're here. But I'm talking to you as a Christian here for a moment. So much of what we do falls into this category of I'm trying. And maybe Jesus is saying to you and me today, listen, if you will let my love go through you, you don't have to do all the trying. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm not asking you to solve all the problems of the world. I'm not asking you to smile when you have a frown. I'm not asking you to say good when you're bad. I'm not asking you to be anything other than who I made you to be. And Peter, on this day, you will deny me. But guess what, Peter? On another day, you will stand for me. You will make the world a better place, Peter. That day's coming too. But on this day, you will deny me because you're going to do it in your own flesh. And there's only one difference between what the Pharisees did on that day and what Peter did on that day. Both of them acted out of the flesh. Both of them treated Jesus poorly. I don't know what would hurt more, the beatings of an enemy or the betrayal of a friend. The flesh causes us to do crazy things. They were led by the flesh, and so was Peter. And on that day, the only difference between the Pharisees and Peter were the tears. It's the only difference. They all acted out the same way. But the one difference were the tears. You see, God loved Peter so much, and Peter loved Jesus so much. And he failed Jesus on that day. But his failure was not going to define his life. And that's what I want you to leave with today. Will we fail? Well, let's start over. Have we failed? Yes. Will we fail? Yes. Is that the end of our story? No. No, it's not. You know, when Jesus rose from the dead and he went and he spoke to, and we're going to see it when we get to Mark 16, and he revealed himself to the ladies, and the ladies go to the guys, and they come to the guys and they say, Jesus is alive, and he said to tell the disciples and Peter to meet him in Galilee. Now, I don't know about you, but that would have been a little bit depressing, I think. Did Jesus just differentiate between disciples and Peter? It's like, tell the disciples and Peter. As if he's no longer one of the disciples, you know. It's like, but I don't think that's what happened at all. I think Jesus said, please tell the disciples and make sure that Peter hears this. Please make sure he knows, I saw his tears, and I'm going to restore him. I'm not done with his life. God is not finished with your story. I don't know what chapter you're in. You probably don't even know. But the story's still being written. And the warning is that we can act out in the natural man just as easily as the enemies of God. And it's easy for me to look at the world, the world, the bad world, and I can put fear in our hearts and, look at all the terrible things that are happening. When the Bible tells us the terrible things aren't just happening out in the world, they're happening in our own hearts. It's happening inside you and me. And the only hope is Jesus and his grace and his love for you. And man, if I can encourage you and me, let the tears flow when they need to flow. Because the beauty comes when we're able to say, Lord, not only have I failed, but I think I'm a failure. And I need you. And I want you. And I'm even failing when I'm trying to do good for you, God. I need you, Lord. And on that day, Peter became a new person. You know, Peter's not defined by this moment. Peter is defined by a man who broke boundaries to bring the gospel to the world. Peter is the man who's defined as willing to stand up right in the very face of his enemies with that same bravery that he showed on that day. But on 50 days later, he will stand up and he will preach the gospel, and 3,000 people will get saved. And Peter will look around and he'll say, you crucified the Messiah. But guess what? It was God's plan, and he loves you, and he wants to forgive you, just like he's forgiven me. Friends, we're not meant to live in the natural man by your own inclinations. We need God to work in our lives. We need to be able to let God speak to us, and then we act out of what God is saying, out of what God is doing. Not the assumption of what God is saying, not the assumption, God did this last week, so he's probably doing the same thing. But we are meant to have that vibrant connection to Jesus today, so that in our moment, we can love him, not out of the natural man, but from the love of God. And we can love others, not from the natural man, but from the love of God. Because guess what? This world needs love. Unconditional love. Well, they don't deserve it. Now you're getting the gospel. Nobody deserves it. People need to be loved. People need to be shown that there is a better way, and you're the ones to do it. You are the people that will bring change in the world that we live in. And it's why I'm excited to be here in San Diego, because I believe there's many people that Jesus wants to save. Can I get an amen? In our families, in our friends, at our workplace, and in our communities. But it's not going to happen when we just love people with, the normal kind of love that we got. It's not enough. We need the love of God poured through us and out. And it's available to you and to me. It's available to you and me. Let's pray, and we're going to continue. We're going to have some time to get to worship the Lord. Thank you so much for watching us today here at Calvary San Diego. We're so glad you took the time to be with us in our service. We'd like to encourage you that if you would like to see more of our studies, you can do so at our website. And we also want to give you the opportunity there to give if it would be in your heart to do so. You can do that at our website, calvarysd.com/giving. We'd love for you to partner with what God's doing here in San Diego. God bless you guys.